He was wearing a police uniform. He was supposed to be the person people called when they needed help. But on one night in 1987, that uniform became part of a case that would follow him for nearly 4 decades. An 11-year-old girl disappeared after walking to a convenience store. The last person known to have seen her alive was a police officer. By the next morning, the girl was dead. The officer would eventually be convicted of her murder and sentenced to death. For almost 40 years, he remained on Florida's death row. And even as the execution date finally approached, one question continued to surround the case. Was the evidence strong enough to end a man's life? His name was James Aaron Duckett. On July 28, 2026, after decades of appeals, DNA testing, stays, and legal challenges, Florida carried out his execution. But before we get to his final hours, we need to go back to the night that started everything. Welcome back to the Execution Files. If you're interested in real criminal cases, death row stories, and the final chapters of cases that have taken years, or even decades, to reach their conclusion, subscribe to the channel. And let's begin. Teresa McAbee was 11 years old. She was a 5th-grade student living in Mascot, Florida. On the night of May 11, 1987, Teresa told her mother that she needed to go to a nearby convenience store to buy pencils for her homework. It was late. Her mother initially didn't want her daughter going outside at that hour. But Teresa insisted. Eventually, her mother allowed her to leave. It would be the last time Teresa's mother saw her alive. At the convenience store, Teresa encountered a 16-year-old boy who lived nearby. The two talked outside near a dumpster. And then a police car arrived. The officer inside was 29-year-old James Duckett. Duckett had only been working as a police officer for approximately 7 months. And on that particular night, he was the only officer patrolling Mascot. According to the Florida Supreme Court's later account of the case, Duckett asked the store clerk about Teresa, specifically who she was and how old she was. He then approached Teresa and the teenage boy. Eventually, Teresa got into Duckett's patrol car. She would never return home. Around 11 that night, Teresa's mother went looking for her. She went to the convenience store. Someone told her that a police officer might have taken Teresa to the station. But when Teresa's family went looking for Duckett, he wasn't there. They eventually went to another police station and reported Teresa missing. Then they returned to Mascot. And eventually, Duckett appeared. According to the evidence presented in the case, he told Teresa's mother that he had spoken to her daughter at the store. But he claimed Teresa had eventually left his patrol car and walked home. That explanation would later become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Because Teresa never made it home. And investigators soon discovered evidence that contradicted Duckett's account. The next morning, a fisherman made a horrifying discovery. Teresa's body was found in a lake less than a mile from the convenience store. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and drowned. The investigation immediately focused on the person who had been among the last people known to have seen her alive. James Duckett. But investigators needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence. And they found it. One of the most significant pieces of evidence involved tire tracks. Investigators discovered tracks near the location where Teresa's body was found. Those tracks were unusual. According to the court record, they were eventually matched to the tires on Duckett's patrol vehicle. There was another important discovery. Teresa's fingerprints and Duckett's fingerprints were found together on the hood of his patrol car. The evidence suggested that Teresa had been positioned on the hood. Duckett had denied that she had been there. Then came the biological evidence. Investigators recovered biological material from Teresa's clothing. A pubic hair was also recovered and was initially considered highly likely to have come from Duckett. That piece of evidence would become extremely controversial decades later. But in 1988, prosecutors presented it alongside the other evidence. And there was another strange detail investigators considered. Duckett had been the only officer on patrol that night. There were also gaps in police radio transmissions during the period when Teresa disappeared. Individually, some of these pieces of evidence might have raised questions. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a powerful circumstantial case. Nearly a year after Teresa's murder, James Duckett went on trial. The prosecution presented evidence connecting him to Teresa's disappearance and death. The defense challenged the state's case. But ultimately, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Duckett was convicted of first-degree murder and sexual battery. The jury recommended the death penalty by an 8-4 vote. The trial judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Duckett to death for Teresa's murder. He also received a life sentence for the sexual battery. And just like that, the former police officer who had once patrolled the streets of Mascot became a death row inmate. But the legal battle was far from over. For decades, James Duckett challenged his conviction and sentence. His case went through state and federal courts. Appeal after appeal was filed. And appeal after appeal was rejected. The Florida Supreme Court later summarized the case by pointing to the evidence that had connected Duckett to the crime, including the tire tracks and the fingerprints found on his patrol car. The court also noted that Duckett had repeatedly sought post-conviction relief over the years. But none of those efforts succeeded. Then in 2026, something changed. DNA. By 2026, forensic science had advanced dramatically since the 1980s. Duckett sought new testing of biological evidence connected to Teresa's underwear. This became one of the final major legal battles of his life. Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant scheduling Duckett's execution for March 31, 2026. But before that execution could take place, the Florida Supreme Court intervened. The court delayed the execution to allow DNA testing to be completed. For Duckett's defense, the testing represented a potential opportunity to challenge the conviction. If the DNA excluded Duckett, it could potentially become enormously important. But the results didn't provide the answer his lawyers were hoping for. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement reported that the results were inconclusive. Further analysis of the underlying data also concluded that the results were inconclusive. The testing did not establish Duckett's innocence, but it also did not provide the kind of definitive DNA identification that prosecutors might have wanted. The Florida Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the new DNA issue did not justify overturning the conviction and lifted the stay. The execution could go forward. A new execution date was eventually set. July 28, 2026. And this time, there would be no further delay. But something about the date made it historically significant. Florida was preparing to execute two people on the same day. The second inmate was 80-year-old Dominic Anthony Occhicone. Florida had not carried out a double execution in more than 6 decades. So on July 28, two death row stories that had stretched back to the 1980s were approaching their final moments. But first came James Duckett. James Duckett was 68 years old. He had spent almost 4 decades waiting for this day. Decades behind prison walls. Decades of appeals. Decades of court filings. And now there was nowhere left to go. On the morning of July 28, Duckett was preparing for his final hours. His last meal reportedly consisted of the prison's regular breakfast menu, including eggs, grits, bacon, biscuits, and chocolate milk. He also had a visit from a spiritual advisor. Then the hours passed. At approximately 1:00 p.m., the process that had been delayed for months and fought for decades was finally beginning. Duckett was taken to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison near Stark. He was strapped to the execution gurney. Witnesses were present. And then came the final question. Did he have anything to say? He had the opportunity to make a final statement. He chose not to. Silence. At 1:19 p.m. on July 28, 2026, James Aaron Duckett was pronounced dead following lethal injection. He was 68 years old. But the day wasn't over. Several hours later, Florida would carry out the second execution. Dominic Anthony Occhicone, 80 years old, was executed at approximately 6:13 p.m. That made July 28, 2026, a historic day for Florida. It was the state's first double execution in roughly 6 decades. 2 men, 2 separate crimes from the 1980s, 2 death sentences that survived decades of appeals, and 2 executions on the same day. But Duckett's case remains particularly striking because of the person he had once been. A police officer, someone who was supposed to enforce the law, someone who was supposed to protect people. And yet, according to the conviction that ultimately sent him to death row, he used his position and his patrol vehicle in the events surrounding Teresa McAbee's death. Even after his execution, one question surrounding the case will probably never completely disappear. What role should modern DNA evidence play in a decades-old conviction? Duckett maintained his innocence. The new DNA testing was inconclusive. But the courts ultimately determined that the other evidence against him remained sufficient to uphold his conviction and death sentence. The Florida Supreme Court specifically pointed to evidence including the tire tracks and the fingerprints found on Duckett's patrol car. And so, after nearly 40 years on death row, the legal process ended not with another appeal, but with an execution. Teresa McAbee was only 11 years old when she left home that night. She was supposed to buy pencils. She was supposed to come back within minutes. Instead, her disappearance became a case that lasted for generations. Her family spent decades waiting for the legal system to reach its final chapter. And on July 28, 2026, that chapter finally arrived. James Duckett was executed. He left no final statement, no final explanation, only the record of a case that had followed him from a Florida courtroom in 1988 to the execution chamber nearly 40 years later. And whatever your position on capital punishment, cases like this force us to confront difficult questions. What should happen when a conviction is decades old? How should courts handle evidence collected using forensic techniques that have since evolved? And when new scientific testing is inconclusive, how much weight should the original evidence continue to carry? There are no simple answers. But that's why these cases matter. Because behind every death row number is a real victim, a real family, a real investigation, and decades of legal history. If you want more stories about death row inmates, executions, controversial convictions, and the final days of America's most notorious cases, you're in the right place. This is the Execution Files. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now. And if this story kept you watching until the end, leave a like. It helps the channel reach more people who are interested in these cases. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the inconclusive DNA evidence should have been enough to stop the execution permanently? Or did the other evidence against Duckett justify the conviction? I'd genuinely like to hear your opinion. Here at the Execution Files, we don't just tell you when an execution happens. We go back to the crime, the evidence, the courtroom, and the final hours that led there. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember that every case has a story.
Convicted killer on death row may be out of chances to clear his name. James Duckett hoped a DNA test would prove his innocence, but the results came back inconclusive.
As Fox 35's Manny Martinez reports, the state is now pushing for his execution to move forward.
James Duckett sits on death row tonight, uncertain as to whether he'll get another chance to test a sample of DNA. A jury found the former Mascot police officer raped and killed 11-year-old Teresa Maccabee in 1987. A semen sample found on Maccabee's genes went untested for nearly 40 years until recently. Duckett's legal team claims it could establish his innocence. But the results released Friday came back inconclusive. A blow to Duckett's chances at avoiding execution, says legal analyst and defense attorney Mark O'Mara.
I think the state Supreme Court, in an abundance of caution, and they should be very cautious with the death penalty case, just said we'll give you one last shot. And I think they've had it.
On Thursday, the Florida Supreme Court issued a pause of Duckett's execution as DNA test results were imminent. The execution was set for next week on Tuesday. But with the inconclusive results, state prosecutors are now pushing for the state Supreme Court to lift that pause.
What the state is going to say, well, they waited way too long because it's been 40 years since collection date. There is a degrading of the sample, and they should have tried earlier.
Duckett's legal team says they'll push for another round of testing, writing, "When the outcome of the results is whether a man lives or dies, there is no valid scientific basis for prohibiting a second examiner to analyze the results." Duckett had the choice, either have the DNA tested more than 20 years ago while the methodology was still improving, or wait until now with new technology while the quality of the DNA sample degraded over time. Ultimately, he chose the latter. No timeline yet for when the state Supreme Court will release its ruling on the status of his execution. Manny Martinez, Fox 35 News.